Kia ora, everybody. Nice to see you. Good evening. Welcome to this year's 2024 Dan and Gwen Taylor lecture, the first of two lectures, since due to the pandemic, which some of you may remember a few years ago, we were not able to have this event for a few years, so we've got a backlog. So this year we're able to have two in a row. So tonight we have the first of two. So just to say historically what it is, Dan Taylor was the professor of philosophy at Otago from 1960 to 1970 after having previously taught in Ghana. And Gwen Taylor was a lecturer and senior lecturer from 1967 until she retired here in 1982. And their fellowship has been allowing esteemed visitors to come and spend some time here for over 30 years. So we're very appreciative to have that as an ongoing thing that the university can't take away, which is good. So tonight we're very pleased to have Professor Kristie Miller from the University of Sydney. She's the Challis Professor of Philosophy there, as well as the co-director of the Center for Time, which my kids have been finding very funny. But she works primarily in metaphysics, particularly on the nature of time and temporal experience, as well as a bunch of other stuff like personal identity, persistence, composition, and explanation. She has written many books, most recently The Normative Status of Time Bias, and another one called Out of Time, co-authored with Sam Barron and Jonathan Talent. She's got many papers. My personal favorite is one called Stuff, which has the memorable line that says, "The world is full of stuff, and some of it also forms things," which I have quoted more than once in my own work. So. It's true. She has previously held ARC DECRAs, an ARC Senior Research Fellowship, and an ARC Future Fellowship. She's a fellow for the Australian Academy of the Humanities. She's appeared on the BBC and the ABC television, talking about how to build a time machine, and has written a lot of public-facing work as well, including on psychology and on all sorts of stuff. So we're very lucky to have Kristie here tonight. And she's the editor-in-chief of Synthase. So we're very lucky to have her here tonight, and tonight she's going to tell us about, should I care about my future and past selves, and if so, should I care about them as much as my current self? So we'll have about 50 minutes of talk and then some questions afterward.
Thanks, Zach. Yes, so that is indeed what I want to talk to you about. So this is sort of the culmination of a bunch of different projects that are coming together here. Okay, so let's suppose that I had walked in here this evening and I brought a bucket with me. Doesn't have to be red. And the bucket is full of well-being. And so I pick one of you lucky people and I say, okay, Mike, here's your bucket. I say, the job that I'm giving you here is I've got this bucket full of well-being and I want you to disseminate it across yourself through time. So maybe to do this, you might sort of imagine pulling yourself out from this current moment and looking down at yourself through all of time, from the moment you're born or whenever you think you start coming into existence. If you think you exist before then, right, up until the moment that you die, or after, if you think you exist after death. And so your job is to take the bucket and figure out how to disseminate that well-being across yourselves all through time. Now, seems like there's two proposals that you might instantly entertain about how to do this. So one proposal is, well, I'm going to take my bucket and I'm just going to evenly distribute it across all of these cells. Like I'm going to give them all the same amount of this well-being, however much that is, depending on what's in my bucket. Second thought you might have is, well, what I'm going to do is not distribute the well-being equally, but I'm going to look at all my cells and I'm going to try and make it the case that by distributing the well-being, I give them all the same amount, right? So if there's some poor self in there that was having a really shitty time and had really low well-being, I'm going to top them up a lot. So it's not distributed evenly, but still the goal is to kind of even out the well-being. Now, I take it that if you had either of these thoughts, it's some evidence that you think that you should be caring equally about the well-being of all of yourselves, right? So I guess that's kind of the thing that would motivate either of those two proposals with respect to what to do with the well-being in your bucket. And what I want to suggest is that that initial intuition, which is, yes, I should care equally about the well-being of all of these selves, is the correct one to have. All right, so yes, that is the way we should go. Okay, so at this point you might be thinking, I don't know what I don't have insight into your heads, but one thing you might be thinking is, well, like this is going to be a very quick thing she's going to say here and it's going to be super obvious. So here's what I want to do. I do want to argue for that conclusion that you should care equally about all yourselves, but I'm going to give you a bunch of cases, and some of them I think are going to pull you in the direction of thinking that that can't in fact be right, if that's not already the intuition you have. So I'm going to introduce those cases, and I'm going to say there are a bunch of people who think that what they show is that you shouldn't in fact care equally about all yourselves, and then I'm going to try and convince you that they're wrong about that. So it won't be so much duh. Okay, so let's start here with the most important thing, Annie. So this is Annie the Labradoodle. There she is with her ball. Annie is in fact sadly no longer with us, but since she's four-dimensional in some sense, she's obviously still out there in the block. Okay, so here's the most important thing to know about Annie. She loves balls. This is important. I want us to imagine that Annie is forming preferences over the following two states of affairs. She can either at this time be given one ball or she can be given two balls. Now Annie loves balls, and what's more, she loves two balls twice as much as she loves one ball. There's no diminishing returns when it comes to balls, my friend. Okay, so it seems like if I were to ask one of you, what do you think Annie should prefer from the one ball or two ball option? I take it you're going to say surely she should prefer the two balls, right? She loves them twice as much. That seems obvious. And what's more, you might think it would be an irrational preference for her to somehow prefer the one ball to the two. Let's change the case now though. Let's suppose she's forming preferences over one ball now and two balls in 3 months' time. Right. Now what should she prefer? Well, your initial thought might be, well, in all relevant respects this is just the same case, right? The only difference is that the balls are separated temporally, but she still gets twice as much ball compared to one. So obviously she should prefer two balls in 3 months' time to one ball now. And then you might think, oh, but wait, that's going to depend on various factors. So you might worry, look, maybe in 3 months, what's happening is that we put aside the two balls now, but we put them somewhere such that they age and become manky over this 3 months, right? In which case she'd be forming preferences over one clean ball and two manky dirty balls. And let's suppose she cares a lot about dirt. You might think, well, in that case, she would have a reason to prefer one clean ball over two dirty balls. Likewise, she might be thinking about this case and thinking, well, you look dodgy. You tell me I'm going to get two balls in 3 months' time, but like I can't be certain of that. A ball now is worth two in 3 months' time because the 3 months' time balls are uncertain and the current ball is certain, right? So she's comparing highly probable ball with less probable two balls. So I want us to imagine that none of those kinds of things are going on. So I want us to imagine that the balls are qualitatively the same whenever she gets them. And what's more, that she's equally likely to get them whenever they are. So the only relevant differences I want you to think about are how many balls are there and when are they, right? No other factors are to enter in here. So at this point, you might be coming to the thought that, okay, so then she obviously should prefer the two balls to the one ball, right? Because this is relevantly like that first case. It's just that they're temporally separated. Now, of course, we know that's not what people, and we're all people, that's not what people are like. So reams and reams of studies in psychology and economics show that, in fact, people prefer less of a good thing as long as it's temporally near to them. So when you ask people, would you prefer $80 now or 103 months, they'll often prefer the $80 now. And if people are Labradoodles. If it's Labradoodles we have in mind, then they may well have the view that they prefer fewer balls now because they're now to more balls later. Right, this is a kind of common difference. And in fact, you find the same thing with respect to negative experiences. So suppose I say to you, look, you have to have this dental surgery. You're not in pain now, but there's some bad stuff going down in there, and it's going to happen at some point. But it's going to get worse if you delay it. So you can either have a 2-hour surgery in 9 months because there will be degradation of the oral whatever it is during the period, or you can have a 1-hour surgery tomorrow. Here's what we know. A bunch of people are going to delay the surgery. They're going to prefer a surgery that's twice as long and objectionable as long as it's further away from where they are. Right? And people do this all the time. So these kind of preferences are known as near bias preferences. Near bias is a preference for having good stuff temporally close to you and bad stuff temporally far away. Right. And in economics and psychology, they're predominantly interested in future-directed near bias. So they're predominantly interested in the idea that you have a preference for having good things temporally in your future rather than temporally far away, and a preference for having bad things temporally further away rather than temporally nearer. But there's also retrospective near bias, which is just the backward-facing one. It's having preferences for having things in the near past rather than the far past. There's not a lot of research on that, but we have some at the Centre for Time, which shows, interestingly, people are actually near biased retrospectively. So here's a question. Are these preferences rational? Or does having these preferences make you irrational? And the answer to this question, well, the actual answer obviously doesn't depend who you ask, but who you ask is going to make a difference to what the answer is that you hear. So here's something interesting. If you ask economists, they're going to tell you one thing, and if you ask philosophers, who are all made of stone and male, make of that what you will, they're going to say another thing. So economists, as we'll see in a second, are going to say that it's not universally the case that being near biased is irrational. Now notice that, coming back to this original question I asked you about whether you should care equally about yourselves. If you are near biased, and if being near biased is rational, then it turns out that it can be rational not to care equally about all of yourselves. Because what are you doing if you're near biased? Well, effectively, you're privileging your closer selves over your further away selves, right? If you've got well-being, you want to distribute more of it to your temporally close selves and less of it to your temporally further away selves. If you've got whatever the opposite of well-being is, like the bucket full of shit, I guess that would be, and you have to distribute that. I didn't bring that one, but like I could have, right? I give you that and I say, have at it. If you're inclined to want to give most of it to the very far away selves, right, then again, what you're doing is caring differentially about where these selves are. So if near bias turns out to be rational, then it turns out that you ought not care equally about all yourselves, or at the very least that it's permissible not to. And what economists say is, yes, that's where we are. So they think it's permissible to care differentially about various of yourselves depending entirely on where they're located. Now there are some constraints on this. There are some bad ways of being near biased, as we'll see, but there are plenty of perfectly permissible ways. Philosophers, on the other hand, take the view that it is not rationally permissible to care differentially about yourselves just in virtue of where they're located. And we're going to see some arguments for why this is. Okay, so we're back to Annie. This is an adorable picture. Sorry, I just couldn't resist. All right, so here's another important aspect of this talk, liver treats. Liver cake, in fact. So what are we doing when we're near biased? Well, one way of thinking about what's going on in near bias is that you're discounting the value of experiences or well-being or goods depending on how far away from you they are in time. So if I prefer that bad things and more bad things happen to myself when it's further away as opposed to near, one way of modeling that is to think that I am discounting the value of what's happening to the further away guys relative to the near guys, right? So of course, if I value them less, then it makes sense that they get the shit and the nearer selves get the good stuff. So, returning to the economists, this is liver cake. This is homemade liver cake. I didn't make it because I can't cook, although conceivably I could cook liver cake. But there are lots of online recipes if you're there thinking, oh, that looks delicious. It's not for humans, it's for dogs. But you could eat it, I take it. So I want you to imagine that this liver cake is going to be Annie's. If she gets it right now, it's worth 100 units of pleasure. Let's just imagine that we can measure pleasure in units. But suppose she has to wait a day until the end of tomorrow. Now remember, when we're thinking about this case, we're not imagining that I make the cake now and then I just let it get stale for 24 hours. So we're not imagining she's comparing fresh cake now to stale cake tomorrow. The cake's going to be rebaked. Cake's exactly the same. But from her current self's perspective, if she gets the cake tomorrow, it's only worth half of what it's worth if she gets it now. Namely, it's worth to her now only 50 units. One way of putting that is she's discounted its value by 50%. now let's suppose she does that again. So from a current perspective, she's now thinking about what the cake is worth to her if she gets it in 2 days. What's it worth? Suppose she discounts that next day by 50% again, right? So at this point, the cake's only worth 25 units by the end of the second day. And suppose she continues along like that. Well, this is to say that she has a kind of exponential discount function. And all that means is that when she's discounting the value of the cake to her, she's discounting it by a constant amount, in this case 50%, which is a whopping discount function, right? Woo-wee. Good thing we don't all discount like that, otherwise our elderly selves would be fucked. Okay, so she's discounting exponentially. Compare that to a different case. So again, we've got the same liver cake. Again, she discounts it by 50% if she has to wait a day for it. But then, from her current perspective, waiting an additional day doesn't result in her discounting by 50% that additional day. She's only discounting by 25%. Right. And then the day after, she's discounting by 10%. And as the time progresses, the discount rate gets smaller and smaller. So this is a non-exponential discount function, and in fact, it's a hyperbolic function. What's going on with hyperbolic functions? So two things. One is that the discount rate itself is not the same over time. And importantly, what this captures is the following feeling that Annie might have, which is, look, it's really costly to wait 1 day for my liver cake, right? I really want it now. I'm desperate. So it's really worth a lot less to me if I have to wait 1 day. But now suppose instead I have to wait 2 days. Waiting 2 days is not as twice as bad as waiting 1 day. Like that extra day, it's a bit worse, but like it's not as much bad again. And so on and so forth. Like by the time you make her think she's going to wait 8 days, that 8th day makes very little impact on her compared to waiting for day 7. Typically, you and I are hyperbolic discounters, right? We're very impatient initially, but once things are far enough away, the discount function gets smaller and smaller. So let's suppose that the function that Annie ends up having is one in which she prefers 3/4 of a liver cake now to a whole cake in 5 hours' time. So she really wants her cake now, and she's prepared to have 1/4 of a cake less in order to get it now rather than have to wait for 5 hours. Okay, so this should seem familiar to anyone who has a Labradoodle or anything in the oodle family. But now suppose she's thinking about what happens if she's comparing getting 3/4 of a cake in 3 months' time versus a whole cake in 3 months and 5 hours, right, from her current perspective. Well, it seems like very plausible, and in fact she would have this discount function, that at this point she prefers the whole cake in 3 months and 5 hours over the 3/4 of a cake in 3 months, right? Because that additional 5 hours doesn't make much difference to her when it's 3 months away. So her preferences have flipped in the sense that the difference of that 5 hours flips her preferences when it's now as opposed to when it's in 3 months' time. Now, this is the thing that economists go apeshit about. They're like, no, this be no good, they say. Right? So Annie's problem, they say, is not that she's discounting the value of this liver cake the further away it goes. Her problem is that she has this kind of function which allows her preferences to flip. So they say this is madness because in both of these cases, all we have is a difference of 5 hours in terms of wait time. And the only difference is when the difference of 5 hours is. Right? And that shouldn't make a difference. It shouldn't make your preferences flip. So that's not the right kind of function. They say you shouldn't be a hyperbolic discounter. So this kind of graph represents hyperbolic and exponential discounting, and you can see the difference, right? So the hyperbolic discounting, you get this very sharp discounting because you're really super impatient when you have to wait for things right now, but it kind of flattens off because once things are a certain distance away, each unit of time doesn't make very much difference to you. So that kind of discounting, they say, is irrational. But exponential discounting is fine. And here's here's a way of kind of representing this, right? So suppose you're forming preferences this time over bags of cash. So you can have your $50 bag now or your $100 bag in 6 months' time. And suppose in that case you prefer the $50 now to the $100 in 6 months. But now you're supposed to be imagining what seems like the same scenario. You've got 2 bags of cash separated by 6 months, but you've just pushed them a little bit further in time. And now, weirdly, your preferences have flipped the other way. Right? So this is meant to be unattractive in preferences. Philosophers think, yeah, that's not good, but they think in general near-biased preferences aren't good. So in general it oughtn't to be the case that we care more about some of our future selves over others of them. And they're going to give us a bunch of arguments which don't go via this kind of worry about hyperbolic versus exponential discounting. So what they're going to say is, look, there's something very odd about just caring when a self is located in terms of how much you care about the well-being of that self. In particular, you might think that temporal location is kind of arbitrary. In the following sense, it's not normatively relevant to the preferences that you're forming. So to give a sense of what you might mean by this kind of idea of arbitrariness, and maybe to get your intuitions pumping here that there's something to this idea, let's go to Parfit. So Parfit is very hung up about Tuesdays. Here's the case. Probably many of us know this case. So he introduces this character called a certain hedonist, but I'm going to call him Bert because I don't know why Parfit didn't name him. So he's a hedonist, so he cares about the quality of his future experiences. To be fair, I feel like we all care about the quality of our future experiences. We don't need him to be a hedonist, right? So he cares about like what happens to him on all of the days, and on any day that he's doing stuff, he prefers that he's not in pain and that he is having pleasure, including any Tuesday at which experiences are happening. However, has this feature which is he's being future Tuesday indifferent. So on any Tuesday, he cares in the normal way about what's happening to him. So if you go up to Herbert on a Tuesday and punch him in the head, it's painful, and he protests, and he's not happy about that, right? And he says, this is not good, I'm going to HR. However, when he's prospectively thinking about future Tuesdays, he doesn't care about his experiences on prospective future Tuesdays. So that makes it rational for him, for instance, if he's choosing between a very painful operation on a future Tuesday and a not painful one on a Wednesday, he prefers the painful operation on a Tuesday to the less painful one on a Wednesday because he doesn't care about the pain on Tuesday. Now, it's important for this Parfit case that Herbert doesn't have false beliefs. So it's not as if prospectively he thinks that Tuesday pain just doesn't hurt. Right, so clearly it would be very rational if every time a Tuesday rocked around you didn't feel pain, because that would be the day to schedule all of your dental appointments and pap smears and so forth, right? That would be great. That's not the case, and what's more, he doesn't believe that to be the case. So he knows that when Tuesday rocks around, these painful things are going to be painful. Nevertheless, it's just a bare fact that he doesn't care about Tuesday pains. And Parfit thinks, well, something has monumentally gone wrong here with Herbert. And I tend to agree. And one diagnosis you might have is that it looks like that set of preferences is just horrendously arbitrary. And why is that? Well, because there's nothing normatively relevant about Tuesdays, right? The pains are the same. What's more, there's just sort of nothing about the nature of a Tuesday, which means that you ought to not care about its pain in the same way you care about a Wednesday pain or a Monday pain or a Sunday pain. That kind of temporal location just shouldn't factor into your preferences. If you have that, if you share with Parfit that intuition, then you should think that arbitrariness is a bad-making feature of preferences. And you should think, look, if being sensitive to the temporal location of something is being sensitive to something arbitrary, then that is a reason not to have those kind of preferences. So that is what many philosophers have, in fact, argued. Okay, so one thing that they're going to say is, look, if you're near-biased, you're really just like Herbert, right? Herbert has this kind of weird proclivities here, and that he's kind of completely discounting the Tuesday pain. Well, if you're near-biased, you're very much like him. So it just turns out that for some reason you care about selves depending on where they are in time, right? So you happen to be caring about ones that are temporally closer rather than temporally far away. But that's no different than failing to care about Tuesday pain, because there's nothing normatively relevant about how far away something is relative to you in time. These things are on a par, and so it's arbitrary, and so near bias is arbitrary, and so it's irrational. Right? That's one form of argument that you find philosophers making. Here's another form of argument. Look, surely what it is to be rational is to want it to be the case that your life goes better, not worse. Whatever else you think rationality might consist in, like this seems like a plausible thing to say. But what are you doing if you're near-biased? Well, you're preferring a future that has more pain and less pleasure. Right? If you weren't near-biased, it would have less pain because you'd have less pain up front rather than more pain later, and you'd have more pleasure later rather than less pleasure sooner. So what you're doing is you're choosing between multiple ways your life could go. There are possible futures. There's a future with more pain and less pleasure, and there's a future with more pleasure and less pain, and you're choosing the former over the latter. And how could that not be irrational, right? Sure. Right, that's the thought. Okay, so this is kind of second argument. Rational people care that their lives go better. Being biased is effectively a life that goes worse. Here's another related kind of argument that you find, which is, look, as an empirical matter of fact, people who are less near biased, who have less of a discount function, are richer and healthier. And let's just suppose that being rich and healthy is a sort of associated with well-being. I mean, it's a startling claim, but I'm going to go out on a limb here. So here's what we know. People who discount less actually do have higher income. They have more savings. They make better investment decisions. They tend to smoke and take drugs less. I don't know, that's a bit, who knows about that one, but they have lower levels of obesity and drug and alcohol use and other high-related risk behaviours. They also tend to engage in more preventative healthcare. I guess they're doing yoga. And generally, they have lower levels of mortalities, like near bias kills you people. Okay, so you might think, well, surely a life that has more money and more health is better than one that has less of those things. Near bias gives you less of those things, so here's a pretty good reason to think that you shouldn't be near biased. Right? This is another kind of argument you find. So, taken in totality, these arguments are supposed to tell you that near bias is irrational and you should care equally about all of these future selves. And that seems to be grist to my mill, right? Because I started off by saying, here's a very plausible thing, you should care equally about all of yourselves. So far, I'm just singing to my own choir. All right, so this might all seem obvious. It's clearly not obvious to many people, but here's another case, and I think this case pushes in the opposite direction. So I want you to imagine that you're waking up in hospital, and what you know is that you need a 2-hour painful surgery. And unfortunately, this is one of those surgeries you have to be awake for, because you've got to like say stuff like to the left, to the right, ow. So you wake up, and in the moment you're quite groggy, so you can't remember if you've just had the operation, although the full memory of it is going to come back if you've had it, or if you're about to have it. So you see a nurse walk past, and you say to him, yo, which predicament am I in? Right, this is a perfect case. And he goes off to consult some notes. And while he's away, you ponder to yourself, like, do I prefer that when he comes back, he tells me that I just had the surgery or that I'm just about to have it? And Parfit says, look, in this case, he prefers to find out that he just had the surgery rather than that he's just about to have it. And what's more, Parfit says, okay, let's tweak the case a little bit. Everything is exactly the same, except that if I already had the surgery, it was actually 10 hours long. It's the longest surgery that's ever happened for this procedure. It was bad. If I'm still to have it, though, it's only going to be 1 hour. So if I had it, it's 10 times worse than if I'm about to have it. And here's what Parfit says. I still prefer that when the nurse comes back, he tells me I had the past surgery. I'd prefer 10 times the amount of pain as long as it's in the past rather than in the future. So if this preference turns out to be rational, if we think, yeah, that's the right thing to say, then that's also to say that you ought not to care about all of yourselves equally, right? Effectively, it's to say that you ought to discount the value of the well-being of past selves relative to future ones. And in this case, you actually have to discount them a lot, right? This is a whopping kind of difference. So the question is, what should we make of these kinds of cases? Okay, so when Parfit came up with this case, there was in fact no empirical evidence about what people do, which preferences they have, other than, Parfit self-ascribing. However, at the Centre for Time, we've done some empirical work, and we know that, as a matter of fact, most people prefer to learn that they had the painful surgery yesterday. And they continue to have that preference even when the surgery, if they had it yesterday, was 10 times longer and more painful. Right? Not everyone, so this is, you never get 100% of people agreeing on anything, but a majority of people have this kind of preference. So Parfit turns out to be right about this. So this preference is known as future bias. Future bias is the preference for having good stuff in the future rather than the past, and bad stuff in the past rather than the future. And again, one way of thinking about this is it involves discounting the value of past experiences compared to future ones, which means, of course, that past bad things are effectively less disvaluable to you relative to future bad things, and future good things are more pleasantly, have more pleasant value than past pleasant things. Okay, so here's some interesting things about future bias. So Parfit went on to say, here's something cool. I would definitely have that preference about my own painful and pleasurable experiences. Oh, and people are future biased about pleasurable stuff as well. So obviously you can imagine that there's some pleasant thing. It can either be in the future or the past. Where would you prefer it? People prefer it in the future, and they continue to prefer it in the future, even when it will be less good. But Parfit says, here's something that seems right to me. I don't think I would have that preference about other people's experiences. So suppose that I am forming preferences over Zach's pains. So Zach has to go into hospital. He's going to have a procedure. It can either be 10 hours of pain or 1 hour. And it can either have been in the past or in the future. Parfit says, look, when I'm forming preferences over the locations of his operation, all I care about, if I care about Zach, is that there's less pain. Right? I'm just going to prefer that he has the less long operation. I'm not going to care where it is. And some people think that that's some reason to think that future bias is irrational, because they think somehow you're taking a more rational and disinterested perspective when you're thinking about Zach's pains than when you're thinking about your own. So this is an interesting kind of hypothesis, and there was, again, no data on this, so we ran some studies, and interestingly it turns out that here Parfit's intuitions about what people will think in this case turn out not to be vindicated. So he thinks that people are in fact going to be time neutral, that is not future biased about the experiences of other people, but it turns out that that's not true. They are in fact future biased about other people's experiences as well. So if you ask me about Zach's operation, I'll say I prefer that he had the 10-hour painful procedure yesterday than the 1-hour procedure tomorrow. Levels drop off a little bit compared to the first personal case, but they're very similar. So that's interesting. Here's another interesting case. So Caspar Hare runs this case. So he says, here's another thing that I think might make us think that future bias is irrational. So here's the case that he comes up with. He says, look, my wife is going to be unfaithful. So I know this, but I also know there's nothing I can do about it. I think he's off somewhere in the UK. Anyway, he cannot intercede. So he says the following: I'm not super keen. He says it very much like that. But look, there's two ways things could pan out. Either she's already been unfaithful yesterday, or she's going to be unfaithful tomorrow. Either case, the probabilities are the same, the downstream consequences are the same. The only difference is when it's happening. And he says, look, I'd prefer it didn't happen at all, but given that it's going to happen, I don't care when it is, right? Shag yesterday, shag tomorrow, it's all the same to me. That's not quite what he says. Okay, so he thinks, here's something interesting. I care about the locations of my pains and pleasures, but in this case, this is not a direct pain or pleasure, right? I mean, it's a negatively valenced event, but he's not directly experiencing it. And he says, unlike pains and pleasures, in this case, I'm indifferent about where the thing happens. So again, we were intrigued by this. We thought, is it true that the regular punter shares and he also makes the claim that he's a man of relatively normal psychology. We thought that was also intriguing. Given that it's Caspar Hare, I thought, maybe not. It would be like me asserting that in a paper. So we ran the study. We didn't use unfaithful women, but we used other sorts of things like this. And interestingly, it turns out that Caspar is wrong about this too. So a majority of people still have future bias preferences when the things in question are valenced events, but not events that you experience directly, like, for instance, wives being unfaithful to you. So people are still future biased. They're a little bit less, so the percentages of people come down a little bit less, but you still get these future bias preferences. And so one thing that people had said about this kind of case is, if Caspar is right about the way people are, this could have been another reason to think that future bias is irrational, because you might think, why would it be that you're only future biased about your own experiential states, but not about other people's and not about these kind of non-experiential states? But that actually turns out not to be the case. People do have future bias. So if future bias is irrational, it's all over the place, right? It's across third person, first person, and it's across various different kinds of things. And here's something further. So you might think, look, lots of people are future biased, but of course that doesn't mean they think they should be. Right, so we all do things that we think are not the best things for us. Right? That's a sad thing about prudence. So it could be, or could have been, that people feel the pull of being future biased, but on reflection they think to themselves, this is not a rational thing to be. Right? So again, we ran another study in which we tried to probe not only what preferences people have, but what preferences they think they should have. So is being like this permissible, and in fact, is it even obligatory? And here's what we find. All of the people who are future biased think not only that it's permissible, but also that it's obligatory. They think you should prefer more pain in the past to less in the future. And if you're not like that, something bad's wrong with you, right? So this is really interesting too, that people make these kind of normative judgments. So there's a kind of interesting puzzle here, which is, on the one hand, when we think about near bias, philosophers and almost univocably, and economists with respect to certain kinds of discount function, all think that that kind of preference is irrational. On the other hand, when people think about future bias, ordinary non-philosophers typically have that preference, and they typically think it's obligatory. And what's more, we find that a majority of philosophers agree with them. Right? So you have this kind of partitioning in which philosophers are thinking that near bias is bad, but future bias is at least permissible and possibly obligatory. So when I learned this, I was mildly puzzled, because it seemed, at least on the face of it, you might think, look, the same kinds of arguments apply in both cases. So the arguments against near bias proceed by someone noting that it seems like the temporal location of something isn't normatively relevant. You shouldn't be sensitive to it, so you're forming arbitrary preferences. And the same seems to be true in the case of future bias, right? You're just forming preferences over different things in time. So if location in time doesn't matter, why would future bias be rational? What's more, in the case of near bias, you're preferring a worse life over a better life. Well, in the case of future bias, you have the same preference, right? You're preferring a life that overall has considerably more pain to one that has less, so long as, of course, the pain is, in the past rather than the future. But why should that be rational? So I was puzzled. I was like, surely these two things should stand or fall together. What's going on here? So far, what I want to do in kind of introducing this future bias stuff is to push back a little bit against the idea that it might seem obvious that you should care equally about all yourselves. Because if when I gave you those cases, you were thinking, yeah, I would prefer the past operation that's much longer, and what's more, I should prefer that, then it seems like you do think that future bias is at least permissible, and so you do think you should treat different selves differently. So why might that be? So one way to think about this is there any ground that could make it the case that near bias is irrational and future bias is rational, right? If that's the kind of intuition people have, what could ground that being true? So here's one possibility. Some people have thought that, look, it's obvious you should prefer painful experiences to be in the past because then they're, quote, over and done with. They're somehow receding away from you, as opposed to if they're in the future, they're like coming towards you. And one way people have tried to sort of press this idea is in terms of some kind of picture about the nature of time itself. So the thinking here is, look, there's a way that time could be such that time really does pass and flow. So on this kind of picture of time, there's a fact of the matter about which events really are genuinely present, namely it's these ones, but now it's these ones? No, now it's these ones, right? So as time passes, different events become the really objectively present ones, and that makes it that there are kind of absolute non-perspectival fact about which events really are past and which really are future. This is not just a subjective matter. And so the thought is that on this kind of model of time, things really are in the objective past, and so something about them being in the past rather than the future makes it the case that it's rational to discount their value. Okay, so one thing to say here is that this model of time is false, so that's not super helpful. But even if and that's something that I mostly argue for. But even setting that aside, let's go with it. Let's just suppose maybe the world is like that, even though it's not. It's still super hard to see why that justifies discounting the value of the past, right? Suppose there's an objective fact about things really being past rather than future. Why should that fact alone, even if it obtains, make it rational for me to care less about those past things compared to those future ones, right? I fail to be moved by why that would be the case. So maybe this is a kind of failure of imagination. So that doesn't seem right. Here's a better way of having a go that's an actual argument as to why that can't be right. So I want us to imagine that we have access to a time machine. It's going to take you back in time and deliver you to the past. So when you get in the machine, you're going to be in the machine for 2 hours in your just ordinary personal time. You're going to have a tea and some cookies, biscuits. And the flight's going to take this 2 hours of your time, and you're going to arrive 300 years into the past. All right, so now here's the thing you need to know. So tomorrow there's going to be a dental event. and you have two options. You can travel back in time by leaving tomorrow, or you can leave the day after. So if you travel tomorrow, then the dental event that's going to befall you is going to happen once you reach the past. Now, the good news about this is that when you're in the time machine, it has certain kinds of pressures, so it changes your mouth in various ways, which makes the underlying badness of the dental event significantly less bad than it would have been had you not been in the time machine. On the other hand, you are 300 years in the past, and so dental anesthetics and dental procedures are just way less good, and so the procedure itself will be much more painful. Alternatively, if you don't travel tomorrow, you travel the day after, in which case you'll just have the dental procedure tomorrow, like the dental emergency will arise and you'll go off to the dentist. And in that case, the underlying condition will be significantly worse, but the procedure and the technology will be much better. So here's what's going to happen. Either you depart tomorrow and you'll have 3 hours of painful procedure in the past, or you depart the day after tomorrow and you have 3 hours of painful procedure in the future tomorrow. And again, I want us to hold other things fixed. So you might be worried about sepsis by having your operation in the past, right, using their dodgy, unsanitized things. Okay, they're super careful back there, like they're, and there's no chance. So whatever the risk that arises from this dental procedure, it's the same whether you have it tomorrow or 300 years ago. Good news. Okay, so suppose this view about time is correct, and suppose that the fact that something is in the objective past makes it rational to discount its value. Then what should you prefer with respect to when you travel in time? Well, you should absolutely have a preference here, and you should prefer that you go tomorrow. Because if you go tomorrow, then the procedure you undergo is 300 years ago. It's in the objective past. And consequently, the 3 hours of pain is worth less pain than the 3 hours of pain would be tomorrow. Right? And it doesn't even have to be worth that much less to make that rational. So in fact, this kind of view, which says that you should discount the value of objectively past things, says that it's uniquely rational to get into the machine and travel to the past. That just strikes me as batshit. Why should you? Seems like the right thing to say here is you should be indifferent between these two options. In both cases, you're just having 3 hours of painful procedure with the very same kind of risks and rewards. Now, an obvious thing to say at this point is, but look, what's mattering in these cases is not whether the operation is in the objective past or the future, but rather where it is kind of in my subjective time. So in both of these cases, you might think there's something about the surgery which is kind of future directed. In both of these cases, I can anticipate the surgery from my current perspective, right? Whether it's 300 years ago or whether it's tomorrow. And in both of these cases, I'm not having a memory of the surgery already having happened. So it's causally downstream from where I am. And you might think that that's the thing that makes it the case that we should be indifferent across those two options. And I agree, that is the thing that's playing the relevant role here. But what that tells you is that whether things are in the objective past or the objective future, that can't be doing the work, right? That's not what matters. So it can't be that a future bias is rational, that what grounds its rationality is some substantive feature about the nature of temporality itself. This case just shows us that. So here's another stab you might have of trying to partition things to make near bias rational and future bias, no, the other way around, near bias irrational and future bias rational. So maybe you think the cases aren't analogous because you think, look, here's a thing we can do with near bias. We can do trading between the near future and the far future. I can spend all my money now and not save any in super, well, I can't because the government's not going to let me. But I can make it the case that I have less of a good thing now rather than more of a good thing later by spending now and not saving. Right? That's a trade I can actually do. But whatever Parfitt's preferences are with respect to the location of his operation, there's nothing he can do to make it the case that he had a 10-hour surgery yesterday. Right? Either he had it or he didn't, and so he's not in a position to kind of act on that preference. So maybe you think that future bias preferences therefore don't matter the way that near biased ones are because you can't make yourself worse off by acting on them. So first thing to say there is that even if that were true, it's hard to see how that could license future bias being rational, right? The mere fact that you can't act on a preference and bring about the bad outcome doesn't seem to suggest that the preference is in fact rationally obligatory to have that preference. Like that would be a weird view. But also I think it's just false that future bias preferences don't have an impact on us. And here's why. So first case, so this is Annie again, but when she's like about 7 months old, and this is Freddie on the left, her little brother. So we bought Annie, this is not the toy we bought her. It's kind of a weird looking toy. But in the example, we're supposed to imagine that we buy a chew toy for the dogs. But they can't both chew the toy at the same time, because that's clearly going to lead to like some bad stuff. And the toy is very robust, so whenever you chew it, you get the same amount of utility, right? It's not one of these chew toys that kind of degrades. This actual one is not, but the imaginary one is very robust. So they have to decide between them who chews first and who chews second. You get to chew for an hour. So Freddie is future biased, and he reasons as follows. Look, if I chew first, then after I finish chewing, I'll have to sit here and watch Annie chew for an hour. And I'll be watching all this future chewing happening, and I'll be thinking, that could have been me, right? And my past chewing is now worth less to me than the future chewing is. So I'll be thinking, wow, I should have chosen to chew second. I'll have a lot of regret. So he reasons through this, and so he thinks, I should prefer to chew second in this scenario. What's more, he thinks, actually, I should pay something to get to chew second. So I'm actually prepared to pay 3 minutes of chew time. I'm prepared to chew for only 57 minutes to make it the case that I chew second, so I don't experience that regret of having chewed first. So notice that none of this requires that Freddie can change anything about the past. He's not bringing it about that some operation was yesterday. Nevertheless, it's affecting his behavior. It's affecting when he wants to chew, but it's also making it the case that he will settle for a smaller temporal allowance of chewing in order to get to chew second. So his future bias preferences are, in fact, making an impact. Here's a second case. So this is a case from Megan Sullivan. We're supposed to imagine Carrie, who is into the CrossFit craze. This is what you get if you Google CrossFit, because I didn't know what it was. So Carrie has decided that as part of her CrossFit craze, she's going to do 45 minutes of hard workout every day. And she's decided that it has to be 45 minutes of suffering to kind of count as fulfilling her goal. So it's one of these days, she's done a lot of workout. She stops after 45 minutes for a brief moment to reflect on whether she's done enough of a workout. But she reasons as follows. Well, I'm future biased. I did do 45 minutes of workout, but the suffering is now all in the past. But 45 minutes of past suffering is not actually 45 minutes of suffering, because I'm discounting the value of past suffering. So I definitely haven't suffered for 45 minutes. In fact, if I discount the value of the past altogether, I haven't suffered at all. So she thinks, oh man, haven't achieved my goal, I better do a bit more, right? And depending on how much she discounts the past, that's going to determine how much more CrossFit she has to do. And you might think, whoa, no, wait, that is some whacked out reasoning, right? Of course she's done her 45 minutes. Okay, so if you think that, then you think that there's something wrong with that kind of future biased reasoning, and that might give you reason to think that future bias is irrational. Okay, so these are some considerations that I think bear on this idea that it's not the case that there's some obvious disanalogy between near bias and future bias, such that you can preserve the idea that near bias is irrational and future bias is rational. Here's another stab at something you might say. So one of my colleagues, psychologist at UCLA, has a kind of psychological explanation for near bias, future bias, which borrows heavily from James and Heather's paper. So they have this very nice paper a while back which kind of set the agenda here, which is basically giving a kind of evolutionary explanation for why you might expect creatures to have future bias. And various psychologists since then have kind of taken up the idea of trying to figure out what the psychological mechanisms, the kind of synchronic mechanisms are that could ground that being the case. So the evolutionary story, very roughly, goes something like this. Look, we have both attention and affect centers. And you might expect that evolved creatures will do better when they tend to attend more to future stuff over past stuff. Right? So causation is asymmetric. We can causally influence the future, but not the past. So it seems to follow that we ought to attend more to what's going on at future times than past times. Because at future times, there are things that could eat me. At past times, I've either been eaten, in which case it's a moot question, right? Or I escaped them. At future times, there are things I can eat, but in the past, I've already eaten. Future times, there are things I can mate with, et cetera, right? So I should be attending more towards the future stuff. Likewise, you might think the affective system is there to kind of motivate us, and I should be motivated differentially towards the future rather than the past, because after all, the future is full of things that I can eat and of things that I need to avoid eating me, and so on. So we'd expect there to be a kind of asymmetry of affect and emotion. And what's more, we know that there are in fact sort of psychological measures of these things. So we know that when people imagine things as past as opposed to imagining them as future, that they are in fact imagined to be less affectively arousing when they're imagined as past relative to future, right? And so the thought here is that both of these things are playing a role here, and in fact they're kind of bootstrapping one another up, because the more you attend to something, the more affect you tend to generate, and vice versa. And then the thought is, look, this is then explaining why people are future biased, because things that you attend to and that tend to be more affect inducing tend to be things that you're kind of drawn towards, that you more highly value, either positively value or negatively value, right? So it's very likely that we are going to attach more value to future things than past things. And then there's going to be a much more nuanced kind of psychological story about the mechanisms for that, which I won't go into. So here's a thought you might have though, which is, well, in that case, you might expect that creatures who are future biased will in fact do better in various ways, right? Because after all, future bias is the product of these kind of attention and affect systems, and those are adaptations which are going to make us perform better. So that's an interesting idea, and in fact at the Centre for Time we were kind of interested in the connection between future bias and well-being. So we ran another batch of studies, like what if anything is the association there? And it turns out that, contrary to what I was imagining, you do in fact get a positive association. So people who are future biased on some range of measures of well-being do actually have higher well-being. And you might think, well, we've got a nice explanation for that. It's because those people have these kind of attention and affect systems that are even more directed towards the future than the past, and that gives you certain kinds of well-being benefit. So you can imagine someone thinking, well, in that case, there's a kind of a reason to be future biased, right? There's this kind of relationship between future bias and well-being. So we don't just have an evolutionary story, we have a kind of rationalizing story. I think that's not right either. So let's imagine that it's the case that getting super fit massively increases your well-being. I'm sure this is false. Let's imagine it's true. And let's also suppose that it makes you go green, because engaging in this really heavy-duty fitness program releases this green melanin. So as you walk around, you can see that people have really high well-being because they're like glowing at you. Okay, so do you have a reason to be green? Well, there's certainly a correlation, an association between being green and having high well-being, right? But it seems like the right thing to say is not that you have a reason to be green. For suppose I gave you a button and you could just press the button and all the melanin in you would be released, and poof, you'd be green. But it doesn't seem like you have a reason to do that, because after all, greenness is only kind of an indication of well-being insofar as it goes via this physical fitness thing, right? Merely being green in and of itself doesn't promote well-being. So you don't really have a reason to be green per se, rather you have a reason to go to the gym and have this, super fit thing going on. And as a kind of causal byproduct, that will turn you green, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you think of these things. So I think future bias is like that. So there are these adaptations of affect and emotion, and you do better, unsurprisingly, if you kind of differentially attend to the future rather than the past. And that does causally often make it the case that people are future biased. But it's not one and the same thing. You can be future biased without having that pattern of attention and affect, and you can have that pattern of attention and affect without being future biased. And there doesn't seem to be any reason to be future biased per se. Merely bringing it about that you have those preferences, that's not going to increase your well-being, right? What increases your well-being is going to be something to do with attention and affect. So I don't think that this gives us any reason to think that future bias is rational. So where does that leave us? So it looked as though we have these kind of intuitions which suggest that people find future bias very compelling, and they often think that it's rational, perhaps even obligatory. And if it is, then we should, in fact, treat various different selves differentially, right? We shouldn't care equally. We should not be caring about past selves as much as future ones. And I've tried to find something that might ground it being the case that that's the right picture. But I just don't think there is anything. I think the right thing here to say is, if being sensitive to temporal location is arbitrary, because that's not normatively relevant, then we shouldn't be near biased and we shouldn't be future biased either, because temporal location doesn't matter, and there's no difference between past and futureness that is different in kind to the difference between near future and far future. And so these two things stand together. And what I think the right thing to say is not that you should be both, although that would be one way of going. Rather, I think the right thing to say is that you should be neither. You should, in fact, when I give you the bucket of well-being, you should be distributing it evenly, rather than, for instance, giving it all to your future selves rather than your past selves. And that's it. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So we have some time for questions. If you have a question, please put your hand up. And our first question is from Charles Bigden.
There is a philosopher who approves of having a hyperbolic discount rate and thinks it plays an important role in human life. It's David Hume. I could tell you more about that, but that's not what I'm really going to get into, right? So a better question.
So does it actually have to be hyperbolic? Or is it just that a discount rate
he thinks that our discount rate declines over time, yes.
That it should?
It does, and it's a good thing that it does.
So he's actually against exponential discount. Like, he thinks we should discount, and what's more, we should discount. I just want to get clear. It should be hyperbolic. It's not that it's okay. It's not that any discount function is fine, so hyperbolic is fine. It's that we actually should be hyperbolically discounting. Or presumably he doesn't, maybe he doesn't.
He's not quite so prescriptive.
Right.
He thinks that it is in some ways fortunate for us that we do this. Right?
What's the
Okay,
fortune
so,
that's befalling us?
Sorry?
Why is it fortunate?
Oh, because in the short term, suppose you know something is bad for you in the long term, but good for you in the short term, right? You know, like he's thinking of a criminal act, right?
Yep.
And if it's happening right now, then because you get a short-term increase in your welfare and you don't have a discount rate, you're inclined to do the criminal thing.
Right.
Okay, now you're looking forward, right, into the future.
Yep.
And you're thinking of what kind of institutions you will use to structure your preferences and govern your behavior.
Yep.
Then, because when you're thinking of your future decisions, the fact that you'll, let's 6 months from now, I could get a big buzz of doing a criminal act, but then there's the longer term bad consequences of it. So I will be in favor of institutions which don't allow me to do that. Right, that's the model. Anyway, but that's not what I was really getting.
Follow that reasoning. Did you follow that reasoning? No, you're not even getting it. Okay.
But that's not what I was going to talk about.
Okay, sorry. Yeah.
So
we can talk about that later.
So
that seems like a wild. That story seems wild to me. But yeah.
But the other thing I was going to say. So what is it that's a truth maker for claims about something being rational?
Oh God.
Right, and I'm not just going to make this like a sort of mean problem, right? I'm going to make it
not a mean problem.
Which is that, there seem various norms of rationality that people have, and people have different, though, norms of rationality. They're prescribed by economists and various other people. So what makes one norm of rationality correct and another not? Well, I think in a way there is no direct answer to that question, but you might say that a norm of rationality is a good norm of rationality if it tends to promote survival and flourishing in members of the species.
Yep.
Then we've got a route, right, from these affects, these future biased affects that you want to discount, to claiming that they are actually rational. Because what makes a norm of rationality a good norm of rationality is if people follow that norm of rationality, and it's good for them as individuals. So there you have a reason for accepting the future bias as a better norm of rationality than the others. There's your truth maker, or potential truth maker, and that's going to endorse that norm of rationality rather than one you suggest.
Okay, good. So the first, setting Hume aside, so there's this question like what makes things rational. So that I personally do not want to take a stand on. So all of this, I guess, is against a backdrop of taking on some stuff that my interlocutors typically assume. So obviously there's various views you could have here. You could be kind of Humean about preferences and rationality and think that there aren't really substantive constraints on rationality, right? There's just the preferences that you have and whether they cohere in the right, instrumental sort of way. And most of the people in this dispute think that there's something more substantive, right? So Parfit and all these other people are taking it for granted that there's some kind of normative wolf here. So everything I want to say is something like, conditional on you thinking that, here's the sorts of things you should think. Okay, so I just want to put that out there because I don't want to make it sound like I actually think that there are these boofy normative constraints. But if there were, then I think something like arbitrariness might be one of them. Okay, so then your thought is, look, here's a plausible thing you might think, which is things that make you do better. For some way of cashing that out are things that it's rational to do or something.
Yeah, rather, that would be a truth maker for a law of rationality.
Right.
People following that law of rationality is better in some sense.
Right. And I guess the question then is going to be it's going to be in the devil in the detail, right? So in the case of future bias and these patterns of attention and affect, so we can all agree that you do better if you have those kind of adaptations. So you attend and you affect in those ways. And we can agree that in this world, those things tend to be causally associated with being future bias. So the question is, but is that going to ground there being a norm of rationality that says that future bias itself is rational? And I guess I'm thinking that the case of the green people is supposed to try and undermine that idea, which is that, no, look, the norm of rationality says whatever, what's going to become rational just is having those kinds of attentional proclivities or whatever, but it doesn't make being future biased rational just because it's a kind of causal downstream result in some people of having those kinds of things.
We've got other people in the queue,
yes.
so we'll
Charles and I can talk about
take it up over dinner. Yes, very good.
But I agree that's it's a thing I have tried to pursue, not because I want to vindicate future bias, but.
Kia ora, thanks. I wonder if you face this question a lot. When you're collecting data about future discounting, I wonder if people continue to entertain an irrational hope about the possibility of change in the future event, as in they don't really correctly construe this will definitely happen. It seems to me very human to, when we're told, for example, you either get the $100 right now or the $80 in the future, to also add a variable. Anything could happen over the next 2 days before this $80 comes in. It might be, and to speak in slightly more economic terms, it might be a low possibility or probability, but the effect size is near infinite. Therefore, some very low probability times some massively large number. For example, the infinite could be the negative doesn't happen, or the money is absolutely life-changing and all my hedons go through the roof. I think. So my question is, it seems to me intuitive that people are not going to fully remove that possibility because that's part of human reasoning. They're going to assume that an event in the future is something they have agency over changing, or uncertain events might occur before it does.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think that's a fair question. I mean, all questions are fair, but it's a good question. So I think all of this research is going to be held hostage to some extent to the fact that you're dealing with people who might not take on board all the stipulations of the things that you're saying. And that's going to be true kind of across the board for all of this kind of thing. So, you're trying to factor out various things, including, probability and difference in, payoffs and how much you value the thing at the time and so on and so forth. And in fact, you have to, what you want is to actually factor everything out, right? You want to hold all else equal, but that's actually super difficult. And in some cases, it seems very unnatural to hold all else as fixed. So there's always a danger that whenever you're running these kind of studies, you're not getting the kind of clean data you might hope, because it could be that people are in fact not holding fixed, that the probabilities are exactly the same, which is kind of what you're worried about. But there's other things they might not hold fixed. They might worry that by the time the future, like maybe Annie thinks, well, by the time 3 months rolls around, maybe I won't value balls anymore. I mean, that's crazy. Obviously, she would never think that, but she could. So yeah, look, I agree. I mean, I think it's going to be always very hard in experimental research to try and do the study in such a way that you really do hold all those factors fixed. I guess the best we can do is try and find vignettes that are sufficiently plausible, where you kind of can stipulate in what looks like a kind of plausible way that people are fairly certain that the things are going to happen at the relevant time and they're going to still value them. But of course, you're right that some people might be thinking, well, nothing's ever, maybe the Earth will blow up tomorrow or something. I sort of doubt, though, that maybe that's playing some role. I kind of doubt that that's a full explanation, that people are in fact time neutral, but that they're always doing this thing, just because there are so many studies with kind of robust findings. But it certainly, I would be surprised if it wasn't playing some role. So it may well be that people are not as time biased in various ways as it looks like, because they're actually sensitive to perfectly rationally evaluable proper considerations like probability.
Because there's a flip side, which I thought you might end up caught on Morton's fork here, that if you do say you want to construct a real situation, then I don't think you can. I think many people would say you couldn't eliminate the sense of the subjective experience at I in a given moment, even if they're not moving forwards through time, because that's not the theory of time we're following. That sense of there is just perpetual now wherever we happen to be located in time. The ontology instead of the metaphysics.
So I'm not really seeing what role that plays. So you asked me to form preferences over, so there's a machine that doles out food and I'm held hostage somewhere. I work for a company, assholes are us, so they don't let me leave the building. So I have to eat, if I'm going to eat, I have to eat the meals from that vending machine. The vending machine is kind of cunning, so when I go up, it can kind of read my taste at that very moment and figure out either what I like or what I don't like. So we can be sure that the food it gives me either has, whatever the food is, I don't need to know what my preferences will be. The food that I get will either be tasty to this amount or untasty to this amount, right? I don't need to have a view about what I'll like in the future. I can either have, in 2 days, a meal that is untasty to 20 points, or however you want to kind of spell it out, or in 4 days one that's untasty to 40 points. Seems like I can form, obviously this is not factoring everything out, right, but things like that seems like they can factor out some aspects of the things that you're kind of worried about. And I'm not sure what the being located now problem is. Sorry, we can
move along in the questions, but good. Next question here.
Oh, kia ora. I'm a counselling psychologist.
Oh, right.
So I'm just bringing it to some kind of application,
Yeah.
Which is very interesting. Philosophy was my minor. But I'm just thinking about the success of working with people who see a future self and they move now and in the near future, because the future self is based on values that they have. So they will slip. They will spin off the line of being with their future self, but it actually helps keep them on track. So actually having a bias for future self can be actually quite therapeutic. If that self is not ideal or perfect, but it's my best self. So we can make decisions in the here and now with that person in mind, which is us. Does that make sense?
So I don't think, I think I'm not completely seeing why near bias is helping them here, right? So I see that they're kind of projecting forward, they're seeing themselves close by and themselves like further away, and presumably they're seeing, one thing I assume you're gesturing towards here is the idea that the nearer selves are more like them, they're more confident they share their values and so forth than like the far distant sort of selves.
But aiming for that future self with the values that matter to me can keep me on track. So a bias towards future self could be actually very helpful.
I see. So this is not a defense of near bias. This is a defense of future bias.
Future bias.
Right. Yeah. So you might think that sort of connects to the stuff on attention and affect in a way that. Attending to and feeling motivated towards your future selves has various good-making features, of which that is one, whereas doing the same of your past selves maybe doesn't, because there's nothing you can do about them for a start. And if things went badly, then you're just ruminating on the badness of the things that, and if things went well, that's great, but that's not going to help you, Yeah, so that might very well be true. Yeah, so we've got some work using those kind of Zimbardo scales of like past and future orientation. I think that's really interesting. So I think you might be right about that. So I guess there's an interest, it kind of comes back to one of Charles's question, which is, does the fact that having that profile of a sort of attending to and thinking about your future selves in a way that you don't think about your past selves, does that make it then rational to, as it were, in some other sense, kind of care about them differently? So if you did have, if you had clients, and suppose you actually did have a bucket of well-being in your office, so they come in and like you actually can give it to them and they can disseminate it, let's grant that they really should be, they do better by kind of looking forward and kind of thinking about how their lives, they want their lives to go and planning and stuff and not looking back. But do you want them, when you give them the bucket, to just give the well-being to all their future selves? Like these, I guess these questions come apart, and I'd be interested to hear what you think about the latter, if you really did have the bucket.
Well, they have to have compassion about the trauma and the things that they also got
Okay,
wrong.
right.
So the well-being
Right.
would be distributed.
Okay.
But it's
Good.
about the aim.
Right,
the
right. Yeah,
aim
yeah, sure.
is for future
Yeah,
self.
got it. Yeah, so I'm totally down with that. So it's interesting. So I like what you said there about the trauma. So you might think, yeah, look, of course we want to distribute the well-being back there as well, because after all, that was them, and there's motivation to want to care about them maybe the directedness is a little differently, but nevertheless, so you want to care. Yeah. So I think we're on the same page there. Yeah.
Thanks for the talk. I found a kind of disjunction between what people want and well-being, sort of going back and forth. So when I was 15, I wanted to get a chalupa at every Taco Bell on the west side of Los Angeles.
I don't know what that is, but I'm assuming it's not a good thing to want. It seems very benign for a 15-year-old boy. That's the thing you're hitching your wagon to.
I'm just describing one of
Okay,
my 15.
okay, I'm glad to hear that, because I was getting a bit worried about what happened in your childhood.
But I mean, I wouldn't have thought of that satisfying that preference as contributing significantly to my well-being, and I also wouldn't think of that way now.
Right.
So I have trouble sort of understanding the sort of ask people what they want as a way of gauging well-being bucket distribution. No, I just want to ask about that.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So that's another thing that's kind of in the background of all of this is it's up for grabs, obviously, what well-being is for a start. So people are working with different theory, like, some of them are coming from a desire satisfaction place, others are coming from a kind of objective list place. So there's going to be a dispute about like what the well-being itself consists in. And so of course it's going to be the case that if you have an objective list theory, it's not going to be that just getting what you want is thereby getting well-being. So I take it the people in this debate, what they do agree about is like whatever well-being is, it's the thing that you should be rationally promoting. And then I guess the thought is that it seems like with future bias and near bias that given that you're forming preferences over the same thing but simply at different times, or the same kind of thing but just like more of it at one time or another, that if that thing has some constitutive connection to well-being, like it's a pleasure or a pain or a whatever, then it seems like those preferences can be rationally evaluated with respect to well-being. So you might, I don't know exactly what the connection is, say, between pain and well-being, and I don't want to take a stand on that. But it does seem like if you think there's some connection there, then it seems plausible that if you're preferring a life with more pain, then you are preferring a life with less well-being, right? If all you're doing is this comparative thing.
We've got a bunch of interested people and a reception with food and drink to go to in our future. So I'm just trying to get to a few more questions and then wrap up.
Thanks very much for your talk. I was intrigued that you said that the majority of people have this near preference in relation to money, and that they prefer to have $80 today instead of $100 in a year's time. And that seems to count against all kinds of savings and investment schemes, basically, which operate the other way around.
Yep.
But we're told that the majority of New Zealanders have very poor savings. So my question, though, is do you think, therefore, this near preference in relation to money provides a policy justification for compulsory superannuation schemes? May be quite a significant difference between Australia and New Zealand, actually. You were suggesting your state requires you to save. This is not the case so much in New Zealand,
there's no
where
compulsory
superannuation
super here?
schemes are largely No, they're largely voluntary here, or not as compulsory, certainly, as they are in Australia. So you think it does? These preferences provide a justification for compulsory superannuation schemes?
Yes would be the quick answer. So I guess the more textured answer would be something like, look, on the assumption that I'm right, a near bias is irrational. And on the assumption that you want your government to kind of create a system that promotes overall well-being in your community and has, so you might have the view, of course, that governments just aren't in the business of interceding in people's lives. So you might have a kind of hands-off view, which is like, this is my house, like you can build roads, but like don't mess with me. So obviously if you have that view, then you might think, look, near bias is irrational, but like that's on you. Like, dude, if you want to fuck it up, you just go right for it, right? So there's that kind of policy view. If you have the view that government should, in some sense, be kind of trying to promote the well-being of its citizenry, then I think, yeah, it is an argument for compulsory superannuation, which I gather is why Australia has pretty heavy-duty compulsory superannuation, because the thought is, like, people do save, and people will save for old age, but typically they don't save enough. So the problem is not that people are so near bias that they just don't care at all about their 80-year-old self, but they're discounting just enough that they're spending just a little bit too much now, so they're just not going to have enough, you know, in old age, and that's why you need policies that will just push up the amount of savings.
Yes, there are many psychological costs in delayed gratification, so brain energy and so on, and that would tend to affect the gradient of the discount rate. So different discount rates apart from hyperbolic.
Yeah.
The other thing about our expectations of probability in the future, you have to take those into account, and there are different models of how you change the reliability of the probability, the significance of it, and also the other factors you're using to weight that in terms of the well-being, let alone how you're going to define it. But they're also looking at the past things. There's more mechanisms involved there in the way whether it's remuneration, enriching your social contacts in the future because of joint memories, salutary lessons, all those things have to be modelled in slightly more detail. So in modelling the future and the past, economists use these Banach-based models, longer ones, with feedback, so you can incorporate all these factors and balance them up more carefully. Is that a good framework to use to approach the discounting of time?
Yeah, okay, so there's a couple of things in that. Okay, so I'm going to partition that into two. So the first question is kind of about delayed gratification. I think it's worth saying something about that because all of this kind of near bias literature connects to all that delayed gratification literature in psychology and the kind of Walter Mischel experiments with the marshmallows. And people often think that what's going on in those cases is that what it is to be near bias is to fail to be able to delay gratification, right? And so there's this rhetoric which is like you've got these kids, and that the kids that don't take that can delay the marshmallow are going to do better, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe that's sometimes true. So I don't want to hitch my wagon to that idea though. So there's lots of evidence that children, when you kind of give them these tasks, are differentially able to delay gratification, but that can also be a sort of response to the environment that they grow up in. So some kids are such that it doesn't make sense to delay gratification because they have very low priors that the thing is going to happen if they do delay, right? So there's a kind of a probability effect. So if you live in an environment where you're kind of resource poor, if you have resources now, you should take them now, right? You shouldn't hang around hoping that there are going to be resources later. So many of these children in some of these experiments might be acting perfectly rationally. And there's this rhetoric that, there's all these poor children who are eating their marshmallows now, and like that's explaining why that they have these poor lives going on. And no, that may not be what's going on, right? It's that they're coming from a resource poor environment where, of course, you eat your marshmallows when they're there, right? That's the sensible thing to do. So I think it's worth making that point. And that sort of connects to your second thought, which is all about all of these other kinds of factors, right? So it's about factors of factoring in probability, factors of factoring in various causal influences that past things have had on current you, memories and so forth. So I think all of these factors are going to be important in explaining why people are actually discounting, right? But most of this is going to be such that those preferences don't count as near biased, as I'm understanding them, right? So all of those things are going to be sensitive to things like how likely is this thing, How confident am I it's going to happen? How valuable is it when it gets here? What are the downstream causal consequences of it being here rather than there? Right? There's lots of reasons why you might prefer things to be sooner rather than later, because they have downstream consequences. Like clearly, if I'm going to win money, I want to win it sooner rather than later because there's all that interest I can get. If I'm going to become famous, I might prefer to become famous sooner rather than later because there's all that trading on the fame I can do. There's no point becoming famous when I'm 87, right? Seems like that boat has well and truly sailed by then, insofar as one ever would want to become, like, I do not want to become famous. So I think you're right that the psychological explanation for what people are doing, which makes them have preferences for where things are, is going to be incredibly complicated. It's going to appeal to like zillions of different factors, and I think figuring out what those are is really interesting and important, and figuring out which of them are rational is also really important. But those things are separate to the question I'm interested in, which is like what rationality does the mere role of temporal location play? Right, so that's the thing that I care about. I mean, it's not the only thing I care about, but it's the thing I care about here, which is I just want to focus on where it is where it is a rationality making relevant feature, bearing in mind that these other things likely are.
We'll ask you what you think when you're 87. But, all right. I invite everybody to continue the conversation across the way. We have a reception set up in the link.
Student union.
In the student union. Just follow the crowd, but this has been, I think, a lovely example of how apparently kind of abstract theoretical considerations in the metaphysics of time can directly impinge on questions about superannuation policy, and that's what philosophy is good for. So thank you very much, Kristie, for taking us to the
And thank you
talk.
for having me. Cool.